The morning light filtered through the pines surrounding David Morrison's remote cabin in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. At 58, David had retreated to this secluded spot 3 years ago after retiring early from his veterinary practice in St. Louis. His wife Linda had passed away 5 years earlier, and their children were scattered across the country with families of their own. The solitude suited him, or so he told himself. The cabin creaked as David moved about his morning routine. Coffee brewing, he gazed out the kitchen window at the misty forest. That's when he saw her again, the female bobcat lingering at the edge of his clearing. She'd been appearing for months now, initially just a fleeting shadow. David had named her Sierra, after the mountains where he and Linda had honeymooned decades ago. "Well, good morning to you too," he murmured, watching as Sierra sat calmly, her tufted ears alert. But today was different. In her mouth, she carried something David couldn't quite make out. David's neighbor, Ellie Tompkins, an elderly wildlife researcher who lived a mile down the road, had warned him about feeding wild animals. "They're not pets, David. You'll disrupt their natural behaviors," she'd cautioned when he mentioned Sierra's first visits. But David couldn't help leaving out small amounts of food, initially to photograph the beautiful creature, then simply because her visits had become the highlight of his days. As David stepped onto his porch with his steaming coffee, Sierra didn't retreat as she once would have. Instead, she approached cautiously, dropping what she carried, an old leather dog leash. David recognized it instantly as one he'd left hanging on the porch weeks ago. "What in the world?" he whispered, setting his coffee down. Sierra backed away several feet but remained, her golden eyes fixed on him, then the leash, then back to him. David's phone rang inside, startling them both. Sierra darted to the forest edge but didn't disappear. Sighing, David went inside to answer the call from his daughter Sarah. "Dad, we're worried about you up there all alone," came Sarah's familiar refrain. "Jason and the kids miss you. We all do." "I'm fine, honey," David assured her. "I've got company, believe it or not." "Company? In the middle of nowhere?" David chuckled, watching through the window as Sierra settled at the forest's edge, still watching the cabin. "It's complicated. Actually, there's this bobcat." "A what?" "Dad, that's dangerous." "She's not dangerous," David said defensively. "She's special." After promising to call more often and deflecting another invitation to move closer to his daughter's family in Chicago, David ended the call. When he returned to the porch, Sierra was gone, but the leash remained where she'd dropped it. Later that afternoon, David drove to Ellie's cabin, finding her tending to her vegetable garden. At 74, Ellie remained spry and sharp-minded, her lifetime of field research evident in her weathered face and keen eyes. "A bobcat brought you a leash?" Ellie repeated, pushing back her wide-brimmed hat. "That's unusual behavior, David." "Could she have been someone's pet?" David asked, helping Ellie with her watering. "Possible, but unlikely. Wildlife officials occasionally find illegally kept wild animals, but a released bobcat would typically avoid human contact." Ellie paused. Unless what? "Unless she was very young when captured and imprinted on humans," Ellie suggested. "Or she might associate the leash with food if previous owners walked her before feeding." As David drove home, his mind filled with questions. The connection he felt with Sierra wasn't something he could easily explain to others. After Linda died, he'd struggled with a deep emptiness that even his children and grandchildren couldn't fill. Somehow, this wild creature's visits had become a lifeline, a reason to look forward to each morning. That evening, David researched bobcat behavior online, learning about their territorial nature and typically solitary lives. Everything he read suggested Sierra's behavior was highly unusual. Part of him knew he should report her to wildlife authorities, who might relocate her or place her in a sanctuary if she was indeed a former captive. But as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the Ozarks in gold and crimson, David couldn't bear the thought of Sierra being taken away. The next morning, David woke to a soft scratching at his door. Heart pounding, he opened it to find Sierra sitting there, the leash once again in her mouth. 2 weeks had passed since Sierra first brought the leash, and each morning followed the same ritual. David would wake to her soft, chuffing sound outside his door, find her waiting with the leash, and together they would walk the forest trails. He never actually attached the leash. That would have been both dangerous and disrespectful to her wild nature, but Sierra seemed content to have him carry it while she walked alongside or slightly ahead of him, occasionally disappearing into the underbrush, only to reappear minutes later. On this particular morning, a light rain fell over the mountains, creating a misty dreamscape among the trees. David pulled on his rain jacket and boots, grabbed a small pack with water and trail mix, and stepped onto the porch where Sierra waited patiently. "Morning, girl," he said softly, reaching down for the now weathered leash. Sierra chirped in response, a sound halfway between a meow and a purr that never failed to make David smile. As they set off toward the eastern trail, David's phone rang. He glanced at the screen to see Ellie's name and answered. "You need to come over, David," Ellie said without preamble, her voice tight with concern. "And bring your visitor if she's around." "What's happened?" Game warden stopped by. Someone reported seeing a man walking with a bobcat. They're concerned about public safety and potential wildlife trafficking. David felt his chest tighten. "We don't go near public areas, Ellie. We stay deep in the woods." "I know that, but they don't. I told them I'd talk to you first." Ellie paused. "They mentioned something else. A lost bobcat from a wildlife rehabilitation center about 40 miles south. Female, approximately 3 years old, comfortable around humans. She disappeared during a wildfire evacuation last year." David looked at Sierra, who was grooming herself calmly nearby. "You think it's her?" "Possibly. The warden left some information. Come by when you can." The rain intensified as David and Sierra changed direction toward Ellie's cabin. David's mind raced with possibilities and fears. If Sierra belonged in a rehabilitation center, was it right to keep her in the wild? But she seemed healthy, capable of hunting. He'd seen her with small prey several times. Yet she also sought human companionship in a way that suggested imprinting. When they arrived at Ellie's, Sierra hung back at the forest edge, unwilling to approach the unfamiliar cabin. David went ahead, finding Ellie on her covered porch with a folder of documents. "Is that her?" Ellie asked, nodding toward the tree line where Sierra's form was barely visible in the rain. "That's her." David accepted the folder with damp hands. Inside was a photograph of a younger bobcat with distinctive facial markings that matched Sierra's, along with documentation about a rehabilitation bobcat named Maisie. "She was found as a kitten, mother killed by a car," Ellie explained. "Too habituated for full release, but used in educational programs. During the evacuation from the Blue Ridge fire, her transport cage was damaged and she escaped." David felt a conflicting rush of emotions, relief at understanding Sierra's unusual behavior, but dread at what this might mean for their future. "What do I do, Ellie?" Ellie's weathered face softened. "The rehab center will want her back, David, but she's been surviving in the wild for over a year. She's found her way." "Has she? Or has she found you because she's not fully equipped for wildlife?" Ellie gestured to the rain-soaked forest. "Winter's coming. Food will get scarcer." David looked back at Sierra, or Maisie, her fur slick with rain, yet still dignified, still wild despite her human connections. "I need to think," he said finally. "The warden's coming back tomorrow," Ellie warned. "Better decide quickly." That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the mountains, David sat on his porch considering his options. Sierra had followed him home, but kept her distance, perhaps sensing his troubled mood. The right thing, the legal thing, would be to contact the rehabilitation center. They had the proper facilities, the expertise to care for her. Yet, as thunder rumbled across the valley, David remembered his first months in the cabin after Linda's death. The emptiness, the silence broken only by his own movements. Sierra had changed that, had given him something to look forward to each morning. Their walks had slowly healed something in him that he thought would remain broken forever. Lightning flashed, illuminating Sierra's form under the protective branches of a pine tree. David made his decision. Morning brought clear skies and birdsong after the night's storm. David had barely slept, his decision weighing heavily as he prepared for the day ahead. He'd called the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center first thing, speaking with a director named Marisol, who'd been overjoyed to hear about Sierra, or Maisie, as they knew her. "We never gave up hope," Marisol had said, her voice thick with emotion. "She was always special, intelligent, gentle despite her wild nature. We've missed her terribly." David had explained the situation, including Sierra's morning ritual with the leash. Marisol had laughed warmly. That was part of her enrichment program. We'd walk the grounds with her before breakfast. She must associate it with security and food. They'd arranged for Marisol to come that afternoon, along with the game warden who'd spoken to Ellie. Now, as David stepped onto his porch with coffee in hand, he scanned the tree line for Sierra, unsure if this would be their last morning walk. She appeared right on schedule, trotting from the forest with the leash dangling from her mouth. David felt his throat tighten as he accepted it from her. "Hey, beautiful," he murmured, kneeling to her level. Sierra chirped and butted her head gently against his knee, a gesture she'd only recently begun to offer. "We've got some visitors coming today, people who've been looking for you for a long time." As if understanding, Sierra gazed at him with those intelligent golden eyes. David led them on a longer route than usual, savoring each moment as Sierra darted after squirrels, climbed trees with effortless grace, and occasionally paused to walk close beside him. By the time they returned to the cabin, a Forest Service truck and a van bearing the rehabilitation center's logo were parked in the clearing. Sierra immediately tensed, backing toward the forest edge. Ellie stood talking with a uniformed warden and a petite woman with curly dark hair, who David assumed was Marisol. When they spotted David and Sierra, the conversation halted. "Don't approach," David called softly. "She's nervous." Marisol nodded, then slowly reached into her pocket. She withdrew something small and produced a clicking sound that made Sierra's ears perk forward instantly. "Maisie," Marisol called gently. "Sweet girl." To David's astonishment, Sierra took a hesitant step toward the familiar sound, then another. Marisol knelt, continuing the soft clicking. Sierra approached cautiously, sniffing the air. "That's her training clicker," Marisol explained quietly to David. "We use positive reinforcement." When Sierra was about 10 feet away, she stopped, looking back at David as if torn between her past and present connections. The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and explanations. The warden, a reasonable man named Peterson, accepted that David had never intended to keep Sierra as a pet. Marisol shared stories of Maisie's time at the center, where she'd been an ambassador animal, helping educate visitors about bobcat conservation. "She can never be fully wild," Marisol explained as they watched Sierra cautiously investigating the transport carrier they'd brought. "She was too young when found, formed too many human associations, but she's given countless people a connection to wildlife they'd never have had otherwise." David nodded, understanding all too well the impact Sierra had had on his own life. "What happens now?" "She comes back to the center," Marisol said. "She'll have a large naturalistic enclosure, enrichment activities, proper veterinary care, and," she added, studying David thoughtfully, "she'll need regular visitors who care about her." David looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "We're always looking for volunteers, especially those with veterinary experience." Marisol smiled. "Someone who already has a bond with her would be particularly valuable." By early afternoon, Sierra was secured in the transport carrier. She'd gone willingly after Marisol used the clicker training and some favorite treats. David stood beside the van, one hand resting on the carrier where Sierra could see him through the ventilation openings. "I'll come see you next week," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Maybe bring that old leash along." As the van pulled away, David felt Ellie's hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said gently. "I know," David replied, watching until the van disappeared down the mountain road. "But it sure doesn't feel good right now." "Give it time," Ellie advised, "and maybe think about what Marisol said about volunteering." 2 weeks later, David drove the winding road to Blue Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. He'd spent the intervening days in a strange emptiness, missing the morning ritual with Sierra, but also reflecting on how she'd changed him. He'd called Sarah, finally accepting her long-standing invitation to visit Chicago for Thanksgiving. He'd even had dinner at Ellie's cabin twice, realizing how isolated he'd become in his grief. At the center, Marisol greeted him warmly, leading him to a large enclosure set apart from the public viewing areas. "She's been settling in well, but I think she'll be happy to see you." When Sierra spotted David through the fence, she immediately approached, making the chirping sound he'd grown to love. Marisol unlocked a safety gate, allowing David to enter a secure transition area where Sierra eagerly pressed against the mesh separating them. "Someone's brought you something," Marisol said with a smile, nodding to David. From his jacket pocket, David produced the weathered leather leash. Sierra's eyes fixed on it immediately, and she began pacing excitedly. "We can't actually walk her on it for safety reasons," Marisol explained, "but we've incorporated it into her enrichment sessions." She unlocked the inner gate. "Would you like to give it to her?" Inside Sierra's spacious enclosure, David knelt as the Bobcat approached him with familiar confidence. She sniffed his outstretched hand, then accepted the leash, carrying it proudly to a sunny rock where she settled with her treasure. "I've been thinking about your volunteer program," David said, watching as Sierra groomed herself contentedly. Marisol smiled. "We could use someone with your experience, especially someone willing to help with our educational outreach in the Ozarks region." As the autumn sun warmed the hillside and Sierra dozed with the leash beside her, David felt something settle within him. He wasn't moving backward by reconnecting with people and purpose. He was moving forward, carrying Linda's memory and love with him. Sierra had shown him that connections, even unlikely ones, were worth nurturing. "I think I'd like that," David said finally. "I think I'd like that very much." From her sunny perch, Sierra watched them with golden eyes, the leash that had brought them together resting beneath her paws, a bridge between worlds that had become something more, a path toward healing for them both.